Welcome to the latest episode of Marketing in Times of Crisis. It's where Io Abbas, get to talk to built environment business leaders about how they've weathered a crisis, and they share their experiences and ideas that may help others get through it now. Today is Tuesday, August the 11th, 2020. And my guest is Rick Robinson, who is a specialist in smart cities and recently joined Jacobs as a director. We talk about why Rick was an early adopter of personal branding, where he marketed himself as opposed to the companies he worked for. We also chatted about the role of smart cities and digital infrastructure in a post-COVID world and highlight some of the potential areas of opportunity as we start to reimagine our cities. He also gives his hints and tips about starting out in social media, as he was an early adopter. Before we start, do make sure you subscribe and leave us a review so that more people get to hear about this podcast. And now it's over to the interview with Rick. Hope you enjoy it. Bye. Today's guest is Rick Robinson. Rick, hi. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. My first question for you is, can you introduce yourself and your role and what you do?
Yeah, so Rick Robinson, I'm Director of Smart Places for Jacobs. I guess I'm a techie at heart. I've been coding for 40 years now, believe it or not, since my dad bought one of the world's first personal computers.
Really?
Yeah, taught me how to code on it. So I couldn't quite call myself a digital native, but I'm as close as you can be at my age. And I guess for the past 13 years or so, I've worked in the field of smart cities, which I think of as the role of digital technology and the impact of digital technology on the places and communities the places and communities in which we live. Okay.
And I guess, what do you define as a smart city? I'm going to ask you that question.
Yes, very good question. I define it in a really simplistic way, actually. I often do it visually. So I draw a Venn diagram of two overlapping circles. One circle represents things that make cities better. The other circle represents things that technology can do. The overlap is what I call a smart city. The reason I define it that way is it's simplicity that hides great scope and complexity. So, first of all, what's a city? Or more broadly, what do we mean by a place? That's a really complex question. Cities are complex systems of systems, communities, environment, economy, physical space, etc. So a city or a place is a really complex thing with all sorts of dimensions and aspects to it. Yeah. Then what do we mean by better? That's a really deep and complex question as well.
It's really subjective, isn't it?
Absolutely. Do we mean economic growth? Do we mean people being happier, less crime, more equality? Better encompasses a lot of complexity as well. And then finally, what do we mean by technology? That's an astonishingly broad idea. Arguably, the cities that we have today were first enabled by the steam engine that made it possible to power lifts so we could have tall buildings. They were then trampled all over by the internal combustion engine. And nowadays, when we talk about technology, I mentioned my childhood growing up programming a Tandy TRS-80. In those days, if you read Computer World and Byte magazine every month, you knew everything that was happening in digital technology. That's so far away from the reality of today. There is so much of this stuff. So that's how I define it, in a very simple way that tries not to draw too many boundaries, but that also recognises a lot of breadth, diversity and complexity.
Wow, it sounds like a really huge, but I guess fascinating and important topic. I guess one of the things that I really liked about your approach when I spoke to you earlier was that you were saying that in terms of your roles that you've had over your career, you tended towards marketing yourself as an individual, a person, rather than the actual organisations that you work for. I guess my question is, why did you look to take that approach?
Yeah, so I guess it was a realisation that happened when I gave a presentation once, actually well before my days in smart cities, when I was working on social media and what we called Web 2.0 back in the noughties. And I was introduced by a moderator who said some of my past work at IBM on topics such as web services and service-oriented architecture had been really influential on them. And I was just really surprised. I didn't realize particularly that anyone outside the company that I worked for and the direct clients that I worked for had any knowledge of who I was or what my work was. And, that was just an observation that struck me. Then a year or so later, when I really started getting into what IBM called smart cities, I realized that I was going to have to try to persuade people to trust me about something very new and in some ways very challenging. And then also, the whole field and me personally, we were going on a learning journey. We didn't really know what a smart city was back in those days. And I didn't have any formal expertise in cities apart from the fact that I happened to live in one. So I spent a few years learning from town planners, from social scientists, from engineers, from policymakers, politicians, all sorts of people, social entrepreneurs, etc. And I started writing about it on a blog, partly as a tool to work out my own thinking, partly as a forum to spark debate. If I can come up with some ideas, perhaps people will argue with them, and perhaps I'll learn more through that process of argument. And partly to share it with people. And I, at that point, took a personal decision, to do that in a personal capacity rather than for IBM. And I did that because I felt that people would trust what I had to say more if it appeared to come from me rather than appearing to come from a company. IBM has and had a terrifically strong brand, but I still felt for something like this that really mattered to the way that people saw the places that they lived in, the communities they were part of. I felt that was going to work better, and the experience has absolutely been that it did. I also I took the decision to not just do it at WordPress.com/whatever. I bought my own domain name, the UrbanTechnologist.com, because I felt that was a good way of describing what I was about. And so, that again was a little bit of branding. So, yes, it was a conscious decision. I'm not necessarily saying I knew an awful lot about how to do it when I started out, but it did seem to work, absolutely.
How did your company's bosses feel about that? Was there any pushback on that, or was that seen as a positive?
No, it was seen as a positive, and IBM was actually very forward-looking on social media, or its employees were. So, in the early days when it was MySpace and Twitter was just getting started.
Wow, that's a long time.
I can't remember if you can still do it, but there's a way of finding out what number of person you are that joined Twitter, and I'm about 870,000, something like that. Quite a few people got there before me, but it's still pretty early. And a bunch of people at IBM who were, really at the forefront of adopting those services, decided that IBM needed some guidelines about how to behave in public online as an individual, but who worked for a company. And so they wrote a set of social media guidelines based on what they thought was common sense.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they were then adopted by IBM officially. And I think actually IBM sent them to the White House at one point as a sort of contribution to the US national debate around how people and organizations should behave on social media. And so, we were actively encouraged to have our own presence online because IBM saw the value that had to the company of having real, authentic people making sense on interesting topics. So, providing we, didn't get involved in anything untoward and we kept our language clean and, all sensible things like that, don't bring the company into disrepute, then it was all supported. And I think that's an entirely sensible way to do it.
And I guess what tips would you give to anybody kind of looking to kind of get started on social media if they haven't really used it, I guess, in their personal capacity or for business?
Yeah. So I think I saw a great piece of research once in the early days of the internet. I think it was by the Oxford Internet Institute, and they were trying to identify patterns in how successful people were in using online tools to communicate.
Yeah.
And what they found was that people who were successful in life, and they meant that quite broadly, happy in their family life, happy with their job, comfortably off, etc., tended to be very organized in how they communicated. So they would use specific channels, telephone, written letters, email, social media. They'd use specific channels for doing specific things. And they found that those habits were consistent between traditional communication and what were then the new online forms of communication. And I think that's something that serves really well with social media, because if you look at Instagram, if you look at Twitter, if you look at WhatsApp, if you look at LinkedIn, Facebook, all these different platforms, they attract different communities for different reasons. And so, I rarely talk about work on Facebook. I never talk about family on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm probably stricter than most people in my behavior that way. But what I sort of noticed was I didn't start out that way. My Twitter feed was full of everything. It was full of Foursquare check-ins. It was full of, what I just had for lunch, what I was watching on television at night, blah, blah, blah.
That's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And, I would... One of the things I found at that time is if I followed someone I found interesting on Twitter that was an industry figure, let's say, or an influencer in one of the customers I wanted to work with, not many of them followed me back. As soon as I got really organized and thought, well, Twitter's for this, LinkedIn's for that, WordPress and blogging is for the other, Facebook's for family and friends, then all of a sudden people were following me back because, I was connecting with people in a way that demonstrated I had interesting content that was relevant to them and relevant to the way that they used that particular platform. So I think that's a really important thing to do.
Okay, so basically having a structure and a purpose for each channel and what you're using it for.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think also, having a mixture of stuff. So, obviously one of the things I use social media for is to make connections that lead to business development opportunities. But if everything I tweet or everything I post on LinkedIn has that character, people are going to turn off pretty quickly. So I tend to have a mix of, here is something interesting and relevant I've read. Here's a retweet of something that I agree with or think is worth sharing. And then occasionally within that are things that, are more likely intended to get people interested in the sort of things that I do commercially.
So how much do you tend to post that's your own content?
I have to say that these days, because life's been really, really busy for the past few months, I've hardly been active for months. And I think that's another thing is, have it in its right priority in life.
Well, you're trying to sort of get through lockdown.
Well, it was more to do with starting a new job and various other things happening at the same time. So I'm hoping to get back more active quite shortly. But I would guess probably about a third of it, say take Twitter or things I'd post on LinkedIn, probably a third of it is content. So it's an opinion that I've got added to an article or it's something that I've written, but not necessarily in a promotional sense, just in the sense of, if I'm going to ask for people's attention by saying something, then I should be adding some value.
Completely, I agree with that.
Yeah. And then, the rest of it would be replying to things or would be just sharing links other people had shared or I'd happened to see, etc.
Yeah. No, it's good. I think you've got to add value to things rather than just keep resharing them because it's like, well, anyone can do that.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I observed, I think of it as content. And I guess this is something that I, again, learned whilst at IBM, which is a very virtually collaborative company. So, I first joined IBM as a pre-university student in 1990, and we already had global online instant messaging.
Wow.
I at one point got into trouble by using an entire mainframe capacity to run a Facebook-like social collaboration tool for students.
You're going to make billions.
Well, yeah, I'm obviously a better techie than I am a businessman because I'm not one of the richest people in the world.
You could have been not the next Mark Zuckerberg. You could have been the original.
Yeah, yeah. So all that technology was around a long time ago, actually, and we got used to using it. Yeah.
So I guess it's how you package it, right? Is that like anything else in the Facebook vein, or did they do something that was wildly different?
I think there's a bunch of things. So actually, one of the things is I think the iPhone was instrumental in this stuff, and the iPad as well.
Yeah.
I remember the city of Sunderland. I used to do a lot of work with them, and they had a survey of internet usage done at one point. And when asked, "Do you have the internet?" something about 2/3 of the residents surveyed said, "Yeah, we've got the internet." And when asked, "Do you have Facebook?" they said, "Oh, yeah, I've got that on my phone." And that was I think they said they were like above 99% of the population was on Facebook. It was something crazy like that.
Wow.
Thinking back now, that doesn't sound quite feasible, but, many, many more people said they were on Facebook than on the internet. Obviously, the internet enables Facebook, right? But that wasn't their
Oh, they hadn't
perception.
realised.
Yeah, stuff that's on their phone is easy. And it was the iPhone with the touch screen and with the always-on internet connection, those two innovations together, that changed the demographic of people who would use internet services to the point where they didn't even realise they were doing it. Around the same time, I noticed that lots of people who worked for the local authorities, who were my clients, were walking into meeting rooms with iPads. They would never have walked in there with a laptop, with a clunky old keyboard. They'd have had a notebook. But the iPad changed that. It, became a different sort of business tool. And again, it changed the demographic of people who use it. So actually, even if I've been the best business person in the world and the best techie in the world, when I created that online forum tool back in 1990, it wouldn't have succeeded the way Facebook did, because the connectivity wasn't there, the end user consumer devices weren't there, the familiarity wasn't. So, things have their right time, and that wasn't.
Just checking. So going back to, I guess, to lockdown, and I guess because you're involved in smart cities, I mean, what's changed in terms of how they're going forward, do you think? Post-COVID,
Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it? So things had actually started to accelerate dramatically well pre-COVID. One of the things I look at is that there's an economist over in the States, Marshall Van Alstyne, who is an expert on what he calls platform businesses. They're also known as two-sided markets. But things like Facebook, where Facebook don't charge you a fee for using their service. They create a marketplace on which third-party services thrive. So games that we might pay to play whilst on Facebook, and then Facebook monetize those services. eBay, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb, all of these are similar platform businesses in some ways. And if you look at the list of the 10 most valuable companies in the world, then between about 2015 to 2017, the number of platform businesses goes from 0 to, I think, 5 or 6, depending on how you count it. 7 of the top 10 most valuable companies in the world are now technology companies and have been for some time. So I think that shift started to happen around 2015, 2017, about 5 years after the touchscreen and the always-on internet connection for your smartphone. People figured out the first wildly successful consumer services. They really scaled. And so we were already seeing a huge change in the economy. And, if I look at it, all those examples that I've given, they might lead us to undertake transactions that involve, physical goods and services and transport. We go and stay in rented accommodation. We get a car journey somewhere. We have some food delivered to us, or et cetera, et cetera. The difference is we're choosing which transactions we undertake online in marketplaces that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. That's a really interesting shift. So that was happening already. I think COVID has just accelerated that. And, in particular, remote working. So I was remarking to someone only the other day, actually, back in the noughties, at one point, I was living in Birmingham, managing a team that was based in Hampshire, France and Spain. My boss was in Winchester and my second line was in Pittsburgh. I hardly met some of these people. I've tended to work from home 6-7 days a week, and I'd travel down to Winchester and stay a couple of days there and work in the Winchester office. So, my life then had a lot of similarities to life under lockdown. So, a lot of this stuff was possible a long time ago. I've also read, some commentators suggesting that working remotely is only working because we are using up the social capital that we previously built meeting and working face to face. I just think that's a fallacy. I'm working for a company now that's got 55,000 employees. I've only met 6 of them. I met 3 in my interview process. One's an old university friend and 2 others who I knew through previous jobs. So, the other 54,994 of them, I'm meeting remotely. I'm building new relationships. We're winning contracts with new customers for work we've never done before.
Yeah.
You can be perfectly creative in this sort of environment. Now, I'm not going to say it's perfect. I'm lucky that I have the space and the connectivity and the familiarity with these tools, that it all works very well for me. There's many, many other people who are not in that position. And of course, if you talk to schools, if you talk to local authorities, health services, police, etc., the most vulnerable people in our society are precisely the ones least likely to have access to connectivity, have a job they can do remotely, etc., etc. And so, a couple of things is, we were in the midst of an accelerating shift towards digital ways of doing things already. COVID has dramatically accelerated that. And it's taught, many organizations that they can do things in completely different ways. But it's also thrown the digital divide into stark relief and revealed that that's a life and death matter. I'm starting to think it is unconscionable that we don't find a way to provide connectivity to everyone. And, by analogy, you wouldn't think of building a house without water pipes and taps. Why do we think of building a house without connectivity and some form of device to access it?
So it's a vital service, basically. It's getting to that stage that if you don't have those things, you won't be able to function.
Yeah, absolutely.
In some ways.
Yeah, and this again is, it's an argument that I've been trying to make for some time. It's an argument that is landing more easily through what people have seen as we've tried to cope with COVID-19 and the restrictions it's brought. It's not an argument that's won yet. I personally think we're going to see the absolute transformation of employment over the next couple of decades. There's lots of studies on this out there. Some of them at one extreme saying that almost everyone's job is going to be replaced by robotics and artificial intelligence. And in the future, most people won't work. At the other end of the spectrum of people saying, no, what we're going to do is create millions of new jobs, things that we can't imagine at the moment. And I remember a few years ago hearing that a cousin of mine had left university and started work as a character designer for a video games company. That job didn't exist when I was at college. And my job's been automated out of all recognition. So, I used to be paid to go design large-scale computing infrastructures to run things like online banking and e-commerce sites. You don't need to pay me to do that anymore. You can go rent it off the cloud in Amazon. The stuff I used to do, to design, to configure, it has literally been scripted and automated away. So it's not needed anymore. So, I'm doing something now that's fundamentally different to what I did earlier in my career. The real risk in that, I think, is in providing education to people. If the types of things that we can be paid to do change out of all recognition driven by technology, then we need to give people new skills. And that's all the way from primary school through to adult learners, all the way through life. And I think it's really concerning that we're not putting that investment in education. My son's primary school in Birmingham is one of the ones that can only afford to stay open 4.5 days a week because it just hasn't got enough money. It certainly doesn't have enough money to pay for all this new technology. What we have done in the school where my son goes to is some of the parents there have managed to get corporations to donate free laptops. But of course, that's in a school where some of the parents are IT directors for big companies.
And how to
different communities.
To do the bit together.
Yeah, different communities, they will not have, some of them, that capacity in the parents' community. So you can see, social mobility not working here. You can see it in action. So I think that's really, really important for the future, is to get that message across to all sorts of people that the economy is really going to change fundamentally, and we're going to have to invest massively in education, and we're going to have to think really hard about how we close the digital divide, because we've been talking about it for decades, but we've not succeeded in doing much about it.
And do you see that as opportunities for built environment specialists, so architects, engineers, things like that? What can they be doing, or what could they be tapping into?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look at one of the big streams of investment that goes into our cities, our communities, it's investment in new property and infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
It's an attractive investment because over a sort of 10, 20-year time frame, you get a reasonable return on your asset value. And there are, established, accepted precedents there. If you build 5,000 new homes, you're probably going to build a few schools. If you're doing that, then you're going to be creating public space, public amenities, public services. In today's world, surely that should include digital skills programs, public Wi-Fi, digital infrastructure, etc. I think there's a really strong relationship between the built environment and technology, because technology is simply part of the places that we live, work and play in, right? I can't remember if it was earlier in this interview or when we were just chatting informally earlier, but the cities that we have today took their shape partly due to the steam engine, which powered lifts, which made it possible to use tall buildings. Then they got trampled over by the internal combustion engine, and we've been living with that for the past 50 years or so and trying to engineer our way out of it. All those consumer services that I described before, where we're now using digital marketplaces to choose who we meet, to choose what we eat, to choose what we buy and have delivered to us. That's digital technology changing physical places. So, you can't separate the two things from each other anymore. We have to design both well at the same time. And that means there's a great role for everyone involved in the built environment to be influencing the way that digital technologies affect us, hopefully for the better.
Okay. So I guess I've seen that you've also got a group looking at special projects over lockdown, which is it called Pivot Projects? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Yes. That's one of those things where you sort of get involved in something and you look back and you can't quite figure out how it happens. So
it looks really huge.
It's an amazing thing. And, it's a very organically evolved thing. It started with a chap called Colin Harrison, who was one of my old mentors at IBM in the Smart Cities team there. Colin wrote to myself and Peter Head and a couple of other people with, it's a common observation now, but, Colin was quite early making it. Hey, look at all the reduction in carbon impact that we're seeing due to restrictions for COVID-19. We're eventually going to come out from those restrictions. Surely we should take this opportunity to research and find evidence for what some of the benefits of having done things differently are, and see if when we emerge from this, we can emerge not back to doing things as they were before, but doing things in a more sensible way that's more likely to help us achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and limit the impact of climate change. And Peter and I responded to say, yeah, we should do something about it. So there you go. We'd formed something. And we kind of made the rest up from there as we went along. Reaching out to our contact networks, just of urban designers, scientists, engineers, social entrepreneurs, all sorts of people, just to find out, hey, who wants to try and do something? So it's grown into this enormous thing now. We've got well over 100 people involved in it. We've got more than 20 work streams. It's global, so we've got people in Asia, in Africa, around Europe, in the States contributing to it, all entirely unfunded at this stage. So it's an enormous volunteer effort, but hopefully coming up with some really good cross-disciplinary system of systems thinking about how we can do things differently. And I think it's just crucial that we do so. The way of looking at this that just terrifies me the most is the estimates show we'll probably see a temporary 5% fall in carbon emissions this year due to the COVID-19 restrictions. And of course, they've been associated with hundreds of thousands of people dying and millions of people losing their jobs. If we're going to hit net zero by 2050 and limit global warming to a reasonable degree, we need to achieve a permanent 5% reduction in carbon emissions every year from now to 2050 without all of those negative connotations. That's a really sobering challenge. And our past track record doesn't show we've had much, made much real progress on a global basis achieving that sort of change. So, that's why we got involved in Pivot Projects. That's why more than 100 people are contributing time and energy and expertise to it, because it's just one of the most important things for us to do.
It's a brilliant, brilliant project. It's a really good aim as well. And the figures are staggering, actually. You just think, so it shouldn't be business as usual when we go back.
Yeah.
So obviously tomorrow the UK is meant to officially announce from the ONS that we're actually going to be in recession. I guess, how did you kind of fare in the previous recession that happened around 2008, 2009? And are there any kind of particular nuggets that you kind of learned about taking things forward from here?
Yeah, I guess that's when I learned that sometimes you have to knuckle down and really do things for the long term. I was fortunate. I wasn't one of the people who lost their jobs. I kept a job. My clients at the time were local authorities. They were going through a terrible time, and they certainly weren't spending a lot of money. So it was very difficult to win work with them. They needed a lot of help. So, I did what I could on pro bono basis, but just looked to the longer term. And that's when I got into smart cities, because I thought, well, there's no money around to do normal stuff at the moment. So we have to look to to what's coming next, what's not normal, be a bit forward looking, and find innovative ways to do things. That was a long, hard slog with lots of work and lots of hours, and occasional rewards for a little while, until the economy started picking up again.
I guess, and catching up with you with what you've already learned. But I guess you had a head start from others with that.
And that, I guess, is where, we come back again to marketing, persuasion, storytelling, etc. If I think back to the early noughties, when it was my job to talk to clients about the value of social media and Web 2 technologies to them, frankly, I was laughed out of the room most of the time. Supermarkets, telcos, banks, insurers, whoever. Rick, why are you wasting our time with this frivolity, was basically the tenor of it.
There are still some companies that do that now,
Yes. Absolutely. I think we're probably we're in a similar sort of place today. I think, there's a big debate starting about, post-COVID, what do cities look like? What do communities look like? What does the economy look like? How are we going to rebuild jobs? And I think there's a job to be done there, and Pivot Projects is very much on this agenda, but it's part of my day work as well. We should reimagine our cities. For goodness sake, the steam engine and the lift are hundreds of years old. The internal combustion engine is not far behind them. Surely it's time we reimagined places around a different set of possibilities. And I think, for a long time, people have toyed with the idea of social media enabling things that are hyper-local. If I give one example of a startup that's Midlands-based, Borrow Club, who I think are really interesting. They're a tool sharing service. So the idea is, if you need a tool to put up a shelf or to fix a gate or whatever else in the place that you live, don't get in your car and go out of town to buy one. Find a near neighbour who's got one and who's in and who you can walk around and borrow it from. And so I think it's a fascinating business model, or an example.
It's a simple concept, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's got so many features. It promotes walking and cycling over use of cars. It promotes reuse of goods. It creates social interactions. It has its own business model. It's self-sustaining. I think it's an amazing little thing. And the other piece about it is, whilst it's a very local idea, it fundamentally wouldn't work without internet and social media technologies. I could never have telephoned 1,000 near neighbours in pre-internet days to find out if one of them could lend me a hammer, but I can survey that many near neighbours online. And so it's an example of the way that digital tools can reveal hidden local capacities and opportunities. So, whilst a lot of the time we think about digital of making place irrelevant, we can do anything anywhere, actually it also enhances the value of place. And I think that's a really important thing for us to look at. And I think there are synergies there with the idea of the 15-minute city, which is something gaining a lot of attention at the moment. This being the idea that everything you usually need is within a 15 minutes walkable journey of your home.
I've heard of this,
yeah. And so that might mean your place of work isn't where all of your colleagues are. It might be a co-working centre. It might mean that we think differently about how we have goods delivered, so that they're not delivered to our home, they're delivered to local drop-in centres. All of this stuff is possible. It's not what we were doing before, but it could be an awful lot better than we were doing before. And it's a great example of placemaking, community, digital, all coming together to create a new possibility.
So what one tip, which is my final question, would you give to business leaders about how to market themselves and take themselves forward now that we are in recession?
Oh, gosh, that's
a hard one.
I think transparency and honesty are things that are achievable with much broader reach online than previous types of communication. I can think of a great example of an urbanism conference, which had a panel discussion featuring the chief executive of one of the mass house builders. And the audience gave this person a really tough time because they were attacking the quality of their developments, the quality of the environments they created. This person, apparently, I wasn't there, I heard about it, but broke down and said to the audience, look, I got into this business and made it the biggest business I could because I grew up in a really, really rubbish estate in a really tough bit of a city. My childhood was blighted by the environment I grew up in. I've made it my life's mission to give as many people as I can a better chance than I got. If there's something about the way that I'm doing it, please tell me and help me learn from it. But please don't criticize my motivations because they're quite honest ones. I thought that was, the people who had been at that, who told me about it, had been really, really struck by it. So,
it's really think, honest and brave, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a particular example, and not everyone's got a tale to tell like that. But,
no.
I think being authentic and using online media to communicate an authentic view of ourselves and why we do what we do for our organisation, that can only be a healthy thing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rick. I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. It was a real pleasure talking to you, Io. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Marketing in Times of Crisis. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to tune in. Check out the show notes for useful links, including my website, where you can find out more about everything featured today and how to get in touch. We're a new podcast, so if you like what you've heard, please do subscribe so that you never miss an episode and more people get to hear about us.